Right, the Ukraine has been through about 2 weeks of war at this point, and I think that we are starting to see the media being forced to shift from its propagandistic narrative to acknowledging some semblance of reality at this point. And there's even a report that is starting to spread that the Russian government, the Russian forces, have isolated Ukraine from the Black Sea, meaning that they can't receive any supplies by ship. That's a massive problem for a country that they don't have necessarily the best transit lines at the moment. They're surrounded on the north and east by Russia and Belarus, and on the south also by Russia at this point. So their only transit points are on the west with Moldova, with Poland, I think with Slovakia, if I'm not mistaken. This video, I don't want to be only about analysis. I want it also to be about cutting through what I think is very dangerous demagoguery surrounding the cause of Ukraine and its president Volodymyr Zelensky. To be clear here, I don't want this to sound as if I'm saying that the Ukrainian people need to just accept domination by Russia and that Ukrainians are wrong in their fight for independence. But you are seeing certainly the illusion being dispersed of what initially sounded like a successful effort to deter the Russians and force them out of Ukraine. I don't think it's really going to continue to be that way for a very long time. There are war maps out there, maybe I'll pull one up, that are actually starting to show that Russia is really turning the screws on in Ukraine. And, there's really nothing that we can do about it here from the US. There are a lot of people who are trying to say, well, we have to censor sources of information that are spreading discontent and supporting Putin and demoralizing the, demoralizing the Ukrainians, for lack of a better term. But the reality is that Putin doesn't necessarily need to win the information war, right? Granted, it's good for him because in the post-war, adjustment, which will have to come at some point, we're going to have to decide what is going to be with Russia. Is Russia going to return to the community of nations, or are they going to be an international pariah, like other states have been in the past, like Iraq was after it invaded Kuwait and was eventually evicted from there? The difference here is that, of course, Russia is a nuclear power, and whatever the illegal status of its invasion of Ukraine, whatever the problems with all of the actions that it committed, including bombings of civilian targets, it's not as if you could just go to Russia and file a criminal claim against Putin or anything like that. And people need to disabuse themselves of the notion that Russians are just going to rise up one day and say, "Oh, enough of him. We don't need it," because Vladimir Putin has successfully subjugated Russian society to a very conformist tone. And even many critics of his regime who are from Russia are acknowledging that this war is not going to change that. This is, I would say, from the Institute for the Study of War, it's kind of a little bit of a conservative estimate of what Russia controls. But it is showing at least some of the pressure here. And you can see that on the south of the Black Sea, they're very, they've advanced and they've taken over much of the Black Sea coast. And of course, Odessa is not under Russian control, but they blockaded it, so it might as well be under Russian control, and they can shell the city if they need to from the sea. They can bombard it from the sea. They can bombard it from the air. It's not as if it's it's not occupied by the Russians, but basically the news is tightening on the Ukrainians in the east. You have over here. Now again, this I've seen maps where there's more areas under Russian control. I've seen maps where there's more areas under Ukrainian control. But where my cursor is right now, let me just move it over so you can see a little better. Where my cursor is right now, you actually do have Russia essentially controlling these two disputed areas, Luhansk and Donetsk, or Lugansk, I think is how the Russians pronounce it, with the G. The Russians are on the cusp of seizing control of all of the really disputed territories, which are the eastern two districts of Ukraine, Lugansk and Donetsk, or Luhansk. And they also have the Crimea. They've also basically isolated it from the sea. So what exactly is Ukraine fighting for at this point? Well, of course, they're fighting for their honor. They're fighting for the fact that these are foreign invaders. They're coming in and plundering, in some cases, Ukraine. There is some evidence that the Russians have been so poorly prepared that they're not even giving proper provisions to some of their troops. And I think it is certainly something that you should criticize Russia for, launching a full-scale invasion, and maybe they weren't prepared both from a logistical standpoint and from a planning standpoint, and maybe they were believing that the Ukrainian forces would just melt before them, just like they did in Crimea in 2014. But reality begins to assert itself eventually once the Russians do isolate some very key cities in Ukraine. The Kharkiv, which is the second largest city in Ukraine, is basically surrounded at this point from other maps I've seen. And this is what's called from some of these sources, like the Duran, which is certainly a pro-Russian source, but these are things that I think you can at least rely on them for terminology. This is called the cauldron in Russian. They basically isolate and circle a certain mass of enemy forces and batter it to death, isolate it and bombard it from the air and from artillery positions, and then eventually it wears down, and either they surrender or they get annihilated or they melt away into the surrounding their surrounding countryside. It's going to be a real problem for the Ukrainians to maintain a real organized front in the east going forward. And the reason I think that I'm prefacing what I'm about to say with that is that, yeah, I think you have to give credit to the Ukrainians that they were able to mount a defense. It's certainly more effective than what they did in 2014 in Crimea, and it is something that every nation goes through that has to have this real forging of its destiny through war. Because yes, you have to overcome oftentimes difficult odds. But this is not exactly a case where you're talking about one virtuous side versus one entirely malignant side. I think a lot of people who grew up in the U.S. or grew up in other Western countries were used to thinking of wars in terms of good versus evil, or occupier versus occupied, or conquerors versus indigenous people. I think a great example of that is the movie Braveheart, where the Scots are, of course, these abused sheep herders, and oftentimes they don't even have title to any land, while the English were simply greedy and entitled and brutal, vindictive. You remember there was Edward Longshanks from the movie, the English king who was subjugating Scotland, and he said the trouble with Scotland is that it's full of Scots. It's a dismissive, dehumanizing take on the people that he's conquering. So that's the way people look at a country like Russia. To be fair, Vladimir Putin has said that he doesn't really believe that Ukraine is a separate nation. On the other hand, I don't think that you could call the Ukrainian side innocent either. There have been always reports of the Ukrainians shelling civilian areas in the east since 2014. There's certainly a lot of extremely sketchy characters that are participating on the Ukrainian side, whether it is the Azov battalion, whether it is some Chechen separatists that have been fighting against the Russians in their own part of in their own homeland, which is within Russia, Chechnya. So you have a lot of very sketchy characters whose only real core value that they share between them is that A, they want their countries to be independent, and B, they hate Russia. But does that make them legitimate causes? It's really a subjective term. That's where the demagoguery comes into place. I've heard a lot of people, even today, there was an event I went to with my wife and someone else. And the speakers were talking about Volodymyr Zelensky and how he's heroic and this person who rises to the occasion because it's in his DNA and because of his Jewish heritage. This is somebody who knows that this is really a moment for him to, surpass his previous standards, surpass his previous accomplishments. Because Zelensky obviously comes from an acting background. There's a lot of different theories about that are out there. Judge them as you will. But the main takeaway from that speech that we were getting was that it's great that Zelensky is out there and representing the Jewish people in leading Ukraine's resistance against Russia. Now, it's not easy for me to really give a simple response to that, but here goes. I don't see Volodymyr Zelensky as a hero at all. I see him as a tragic victim of what I think will be ultimately the defeat of Ukraine. And there's two different roles that he can fulfill. He can either be a martyr, meaning that the Russians will succeed in locating and killing him, or he will escape and he'll be known basically as a person who asked other people to make all these sacrifices and then couldn't do the sacrifice himself. I was just talking about people's perceptions. Or, and follow me here, he will yield to the Russians and surrender to them and become basically a puppet. Remember in Braveheart there was Robert De Bruce, later getting his own treatment in film. Robert De Bruce in Braveheart, which is again only based on a true story. It's not really an accurate depiction of those wars in I think it was the 13th century. Robert De Bruce was a Scottish nobleman who ended up yielding to the English, and then eventually later fighting and defeating them. But Zelensky will have basically exhausted all the options. So those are like the real end games for him. I think that there will be the option of either going into exile or relocating Ukraine's central government to Western Ukraine, somewhere in this area. Lviv is generally considered the main candidate for a new capital for the rump Ukrainian nation. And unfortunately, in either one or all of those cases, he will not be seen as a hero among Ukrainians, but I think he will be used as a scapegoat. And this is no judgment on his conduct. Like, yes, I think that in a certain case it takes courage to stand up against a military power that is much more superior to you in terms of their logistics, in terms of their experience, in terms of every single metric that you put, landmass, economic power and everything. So the Russians certainly expected a pushover, and they've had a pushover before. That's what happened in 2014 when they marched into Crimea. Ukraine has changed somewhat since then, and yet Volodymyr Zelensky, with all of his media appearances, with all of the mythology about what he said. For example, people have said, well, you can admire somebody who was given the offer to leave Ukraine and flee for safety, and he said, I don't need a plane. I think that the line is, I don't need a plane. I need a rifle or something. Whatever the case is, there's no evidence that conversation ever happened. Certainly, it's to his credit that he is leading his people from apparently an area where he's under threat. And I would say that, in a moment like this, after all these opportunities to avoid what's going on have failed, I think that certainly it's good that people analyze the character of people who are making very bold sacrifices, and try to find a little bit of a positive element in them. But you can't turn it into some sort of uh, folk hero fable character in real time, because once people start to realize that so much of the narrative is false, and that unfortunately Ukraine is a very, very corrupt country, and that Zelensky himself by no means had his hands clean of any of that corruption, and that if Russia were to leave tomorrow, Ukraine would still be a miserable country run by very venal and greedy people. There's no amount of dressing and garnishing that can be put on it that will, in my opinion, justify where they have gotten themselves. This should have never happened. The Ukrainian nation, I think, made a terrible mistake when it decided to overthrow the Yanukovych government back in 2014. Now, I've listened to a number of different sources on this. Granted, some of them are a little bit, I think, over the top. We watched this weekend the Oliver Stone documentary, Ukraine on Fire, which I do recommend you at least watch. There is a number of inaccuracies in it, but yeah, you see angles of it where obviously there were very extreme ultranationalist groups in Ukraine that their motive isn't simply to keep Ukraine independent of Russia. They actually do hate Russians. They hate ethnic Russian separatists or even regular citizens of Ukraine. They want to expunge any Russian presence from Ukrainian society and create some sort of ideal Ukrainian nation that's only for Ukrainians. So they don't like the Russians. There's indications they don't like some of the other minority groups in Ukraine, whether it's the Crimean Tatars, whether it is the Jews, whether it is there's some sort of Greek minority in Ukraine, whatever the case may be. There's groups like the Azov Battalion, like Right Sector. There's a number of other ones that they were like documenting in there, and yet we're being told. I'm not saying you, but we where I live have been told, well, Ukrainians are just this courageous side that they're basically being put up against the wall, and you cannot be skeptical of any of these stories that are going on, whether it's this bullshit goes to Kiev or the martyrs of Snake Island, which didn't happen. Those people were captured. Maybe their treatment under Russian custody isn't great, but don't falsify the record in order to make your side look better. And now we're hearing about all of this dirty laundry that was hidden from us. Bio labs in Ukraine, whatever the characteristics of, I don't know what the purpose of them are, but why is the United States involved? A, in the defense of Ukraine to a certain extent, B, in the Ukrainian economy, C, in Ukraine's energy sector, and D, now in light of the COVID-19 crisis that we just went through, are we involved in any sort of biotechnology issues? Whether it is military or civilian use, why in Ukraine? Why does it always seem to be that these very risky and ill-conceived ventures happen in a country that's one of the most corrupt countries in Europe, that is very conflicted, that is vulnerable to infiltration from a foreign power, which is Russia? Why? There is no rational answer that will allay my fears that the United States has built another house of cards that will come crashing down on all of us. And therefore, I ask, the people who are out there trying to, you know, to praise Zelensky and turn him into something that he isn't. This great hero, this Ukrainian hero, or in some cases they call him a Jewish hero or whatever. He is nobody's hero. He is a person who is trapped in a very difficult situation. I think he's trying to make the best situation they can, obviously, because he's not going to get actual help from NATO in the form that he needs, which would be a military intervention. They're not going to risk it because they are up against a nuclear power. He's not going to get that help from the U.S. specifically. He's not going to get any sort of actual help that will prevent Ukraine from falling under Russian control. And at the end of the day, let's say that the war ended tomorrow. Do you really believe that the Ukrainians will be able to force Russian forces out of any of this Ukrainian territory that they've seized? No. I would say that the minimum that will be the result is that the eastern areas of Ukraine, Lugansk and Donetsk, are going to be either given full autonomy or recognized as demilitarized zones or even conceded to Russia. Crimea will be conceded to Russia. And Ukraine will have to bend over and say, no, we will not be part of the EU or NATO. We commit to being unaligned and perhaps even subjugated to Russia, meaning that this has happened in countries in the past. This happened to Germany after World War One. An entire area of the country will be demilitarized and it will be patrolled militarily by another country, Russia. Russia will say, no, we will be responsible for Ukraine's security in the east. You can have nominal civilian control, and Ukraine will basically be divided into different zones. One zone will be free Ukraine, whatever that will mean, and the other zone will be, controlled Ukraine. And that's the way it's going to be. And this isn't in order to say that that's right or moral or something that the Ukrainians deserve or something that you should be happy with. But it is what's happening, and it's the no frills truth. If I'm right, of course, everything could go the opposite way. It could be that these people are predicting that Zelensky will fend off the Russians, like it'll happen, and they'll suddenly take to the hills and run away, right? I mean, that's really going to happen. No, I don't predict that will happen. I do predict that Russia, we've gone this far, they're going to press ahead. The sanctions haven't scared them. The United States is clearly roiled by the effects of sanctions on our own economy. And ultimately, I think Putin will come out of this crisis. He may have suffered in the short term, but I think that the world knows that they cannot keep Russia isolated because they need stabilization in certain sectors of the world. They need stabilization in terms of the relationship with some of these countries in Central Asia or in the Caucasus region or in the Arctic region. Right? These are parts of the world that we don't really think of. There's complicated processes that happen there that you can't just have a nation as large, powerful, and secretive as Russia completely cut off from the rest of the world. The United States will have to work with Russia again. Doesn't mean that you have to be happy with it. It doesn't mean. I mean, there's certainly areas where I think, I mean, Putin literally has crossed the line. He's had, besides using nuclear weapons, he's shown that he's not afraid to flex on the Biden administration, on the European Union, on Macron, on Boris Johnson, on anybody else. He knows that he can depend on certain lifelines from China, even certain lifelines from India, because we don't live in a world where any country is completely independent. That's the illusion here, that Ukraine is fighting for its independence. It's an illusion. Ukraine is not going to be independent even if it wins. Russia's independence has been compromised because they're very dependent financially now on China. So we live in a very interdependent world, not in a good way, and we have to remember that. And there's certainly there's sobering realities that I think many people are waking up to. That's about it. Please like, share, and subscribe. End the demagoguery. Stop pretending any of these people are heroes, whether it is Zelensky or Putin. There are people who are saying the same thing about Putin, that he's this hero, and no. There are no heroes in this. It's a very sad situation. Please like, share, and subscribe. Find me on Odyssey, Rumble, BitChute, YouTube, Podbean, Gab, Mind, Substack, Telegram, and Getter, and take it easy.